So I'm glad to be here this evening.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm also very happy to be here this evening with my good friend Adam. And I am born and raised in Vitória, Brazil. I made a joke about it the first time, but I I don't think it's going to be funny again. So I'm born and raised in Vitória, which is an island by the coast of Brazil. And when I say by the coast, um, what I mean is that we have bridges connecting the island to the continent. Whenever I say I'm from an island, people usually expect me to be good, like um, in canoeing, paddling, that kind of stuff, right? Oh, he's from an island. Okay, yeah, I'm a good swimmer. I did save a couple of people to die in the sea, more than a couple times. And I have asthma since I was a kid, so I had to take swimming lessons to get better. I am the director of the Language and Culture Resource Center at ETSU and assistant professor of Spanish in the Literature and Language Department. And well, I can only hope to also say in my grave community advocate, because I do have a passion as well to help everyone. So
Very good.
Wonderful.
Very good.
Fabulous. Yeah. So how did you get to Johnson City?
okay, so I well, there are very like different ways to start a story like that, right? I guess I should tell you why or how did I come to the U.S. first. So I was a teacher in an elementary school in Brazil, and it was the most expensive elementary school in my state, in the whole state. The tuition was, and I'm not kidding, um, to this day about 2,000 reais, which is the Brazilian money, a month. So back when I was a teacher there and Brazilian money and dollars were more at par, we were talking about $1,000 a month to go to elementary school. It was ridiculous. And I was well paid, well fed, um, and then I had a bad experience that made me think that that wasn't the place for me because I had just successfully defended my master's thesis, and I had a baby with 2 weeks apart. And my coordinator came to me and said, "Well, you turned in your grades late. What is going on? That never happened before." And I was working there for about 3 years at that point. And I thought, well, you know, you know what happened. I mean, within 2 weeks, I defended my master thesis and had a baby. And last week specifically, I spent the whole week awake because my wife was having postpartum depression and my baby was crying all night long, as all newborns do or supposed to do. So, yeah, I had a hard time. And she looked at me and said, "But that's your wife's job. That's why she has paid maternity leave. You shouldn't be the one doing that. You are the one who needs to provide for the family, and you better do that well here. Otherwise," and I thought, well, otherwise, I don't want to work here anymore, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't say that to her because, well, we need to work. We need to put food on the table, right? So instead, I talked with a good friend of mine who was already here doing his PhD, and I said, "Well, I need a change of pace. I need a change of context. Things are not working out for me here anymore." And because I was already at the top of my hometown, my only option was to go somewhere else. And I had this good friend of mine who, for me, it's like a brother, Paulo Dutra. He is also a professor nowadays at UNM, University of New Mexico. And I told him, well, I want to go to where you are. I want to go do my PhD. I want to try something different for my family. And he said, yeah, I'll help you with the paperwork and everything. I had my master's already, and I learned how to speak and how to read and write in English. I started to learn from an early age, about 10 or 11. I wanted to play role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, and they were all in English. So I would get a dictionary and read 1 page a day. and so I did everything, and I applied for Purdue, and they accepted me. I didn't know back then that you were supposed to apply to a bunch of programs and then choose the better deal, right? No, I applied only for Purdue, and I told them that I was leaving and that I was going to Purdue the moment that I submitted my application, which I also realized after I came was crazy, because that's not how things work, right? But still, luckily, things worked my way. So I went to Purdue, did my PhD, learned some stuff, right? Learned how you're supposed to apply for jobs or positions.
Right.
So I applied for over 150 positions when I finished my PhD. And I got, let's say, 10 or 15 something phone interviews and computer interviews out of those. I do a lot of different stuff. I don't just teach Spanish. I have other skills. I do translations. I do interpretations. My master's was done in Brazil and in literature. It was like literary studies. I didn't have a specific field. So when it comes to applying for a job, there's a lot of stuff that I can do and a lot of things that I qualify for. So out of those 150 applications, I got about 4 campus visits, and out of those, 3 job offers. And I choose to come to TSU. It was the most appealing offer to me because I like the challenge of being both a professor and a director. I was fresh, just out of the PhD program, with a lot of ideas and a lot of energy to put those ideas to practice. And I decided to move here, and that's how.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your first job out of Purdue was straight to Johnson City?
Yes, was my first job, just straight out of Purdue.
And how was that adjustment?
It was amazingly easy. I mean, since I was a kid, I always told everyone that I wanted to live in the mountains and that I liked the mountain climate. And that, for someone coming from an island, right? Yeah. My mom, she hates the cold, like she's terrified. She never came visit me, and she says that she never will because of the cold. And we're talking Tennessee cold. I'm not talking Indiana cold. Indiana cold, it's something that she can't comprehend. It can't get through her mind how I could stand minus 33 degrees. It's out of her comprehension of what cold means. Like the maximum cold that it gets in our hometown is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That with that temperature, my mom wouldn't leave the house because it's too cold outside.
Oh my.
So.
Wow, I feel her on that. I concur.
And I hated Indiana. I hated everything about living there. I missed the sea. I missed the water. I still miss that here, but I don't miss the mountains as much as I did there. Because my hometown, although it's an island, we do have mountains in the horizon. They're close by, and you can go and have a weekend in the mountains, and I love to do that. So here I have this strange illusion that I'm just having a weekend in the mountains, and that I can get in my car and in 1 hour, 2 hours be by the sea, which now, well, takes longer than that, but still I have that possibility, right? In Indiana, I felt completely, literally out of water.
Right.
I mean, it was brutal to live there. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna start asking hard questions. So Brazil, what is Adam, you know what the racial kind of differences are here in, like, this is considered the South. Is it different here, Felipe, for you, with the whole racism issue that we have in this country? Do you have stuff like that in Brazil? Colorism, that sort of thing?
We do. In my opinion, my honest opinion, it's worse in Brazil. It's worse in Brazil because there is lack of awareness. There is lack of awareness about identity. There is lack of awareness about what racist is, and so on. And I can give you 100 reasons of why that is that way, but I'll tell you two. So by the end of the 19th century, the empire, because back then Brazil was an empire, the royal family of Portugal moved from Portugal to Brazil to run away from Napoleon. When he invaded Spain, they looked and said, okay, we're out of here. So we're talking about 14 ships full of gold and books and everything, and they moved to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro. So they started to create and recreate their empire, right? So that's when Brazil got his first university. That's when we got the National Library, which is in Rio. That's when they built castles in Rio that are still there to this day. And the Dom Peter, the prince back then, because who moved was Dom João, the king, he created a city after himself. We have a city called Petrópolis, which it translates as the city of Peter. So, and there is a palace there and everything like that. So by the end of the 19th century, his son, Dom Peter II, Dom Pedro II, created a policy to whiten the population because they were in fear that after the War of Paraguay, the African Brazilians were spreading too much and our population was too black. So they can create this whitening policy, which consisted in bringing more immigrants from countries in Europe that didn't have colonies of their own. So they made proposals to Italy and to Germany. And over 100,000 of each country, 100,000 people from each country came to Brazil by the beginning of the 20th century. And that wasn't enough. They also made the same proposition to Japan. And Brazil has in São Paulo the biggest Japanese community outside of Japan in the whole world because of that. Currently, yes.
Something
And
else.
we celebrate October. We have the second biggest Oktoberfest in the world in the south of Brazil because of Germany. And you can have a sense about how crazy that is. And because when the Republic began, they continue with the same policy. And actually the end of slavery still happened in the empire. The empress, which some books don't even talk about her, and some people are not even aware that Brazil had 3 emperors, and yeah, well, 2 emperors, emperors and 1 empress. So she was the one who signed the law abolishing slavery, Princess Isabel. And because of that, the oligarchies, the white oligarchies of Portuguese took her down in response to that. So After that, later on, another consequence, another big thing is a thinker. Well, I would say two big things. There was another war called Canudos that happened in the Northeast when a man who claimed himself to be a priest established a communist society. And the new president had to crush that, right? So communism wouldn't spread. That's their logic, of course, not mine. So they went and did a massacre, killing everyone. And there is a book called Os Sertões, which is a piece of journalism written by a man called Euclides da Cunha, where he describes that war because he was a reporter sent to write about that war. But instead of just telling what happened, he writes about 800 pages describing first the environment of the war, which is the Brazilian Northeast, then the people who live there, who are all of mixed race, as he depicts them in the book, and later the war itself. So based on that literary work, if we can call it that, another thinker from Brazil wrote a huge essay and a huge work. His name was Gilberto Freire, and the name of the book is Casa Grande and Senzala. So the Casa Grande is the big house, and Senzala is where the slaves used to live. And he writes in that essay that racism in Brazil is that racism in the US is worse than in Brazil because we are so mixed up. So because you can't tell who is who, because you can tell the people's backgrounds, then racism doesn't exist. It became a matter of who has the money and who doesn't. Because the big house, some slaves moved in the big house and they have bedrooms. And the structures of even the apartments in Brazil to the 80s still had a bedroom for the helper who had to stay overnight. Why? Well, because public transportation wasn't enough about 30, 40 years ago. And they couldn't go to the outskirts of the towns where they live. People with money used to live downtown. Now things are kind of changing. So that created a myth of a racial democracy where race, it's not an issue, and having money becomes the issue. And a lot of people still buy into that. And a lot of people still believe in that policy because he was a very good writer, a professor, respected professor, and his study is sound. And he had some very good sources to try to defend this standpoint. The biggest one is the fact that Brazil has some unique traits in what concerns slavery. We had one slave called Chica da Silva who married a white man in the 19th century still. And she became a lady in the town, and she would dress like a lady, and she would go to, and she would host parties. And she has, there are still grandchildren that they had together as a couple. And when you tell something like that to someone, they say, well, that's different. That really shows that racism, it's not as big. Now,
caste complex.
Exactly, it's a caste complex, and it's very still rooted in our culture to the point that if you were asking this question to another Brazilian who came from a different background than the one that I came, they would probably very likely answer it in a different way and say that it's worse here, because there are some people in Brazil who still truly believe that there is no racism in Brazil.
We got that here too.
That it's just a matter of money. If you have the money, then there is no racism against you. But we do, I can give you some striking examples, many striking examples of how that's not true. My favorite one is Nayara Justino. Nayara Justino is a dancer who was chosen to be for a position called Globeleza. Now, what is Globeleza? You all know that Brazil has one of the famous carnivals in the world, right? You probably know Brazil for that. So in the 90s, they started to put a naked woman dancing on TV. Well, we had the naked women dancing on the street, right? All the time during Carnival. But this one was dancing on TV throughout the whole day for everyone to see. And the only thing that she would be wearing would be painting. And the painting was made by her husband, who was an artist. So she danced naked for about 15 years in Brazilian TV. Well, maybe a little bit more. So once she retired, or the TV station retired her, Brazil has one big TV station called Globo. Beleza is a word that means beauty. So Globeleza, it's the beauty from Globo, the dancer. And she would be the one advertising Carnival. The thing is, she was African Brazilian, but her skin wasn't too dark. She would be what people would say, some people would call 50, 70 years ago, maybe Dubois would call that mulatto, right? A word that, thank God, we are not using anymore, but I just refer so you can understand what I'm going to say next. So once she retired, they started to do a competition to choose a new dancer from time to time. Nayara Justino was the second one to be chosen to replace her. After about 1.5 months that she was dancing, they took her out of the air and replaced her for someone else. Why? Because the TV station started to get complaints saying that they didn't want that woman dancing on TV, complaining about, and the words that they would use to describe her, you can all imagine. And the revolt of the population had to do to the fact that she was darker. She wouldn't be considered a mulatto. She was African American, black, and that's it. So they took her down, and to this day, there was no consequence to the TV station. She lost her job, she lost her career, there was no compensation to her. Brazilian lawyers or Brazilian judges did nothing to stop that. Nothing. To this day, nothing was done to fix that.
And it was purely an issue of skin color.
It was purely an issue of skin color. And then after that, what they did to stop this discussion, they replaced the idea of what Globeleza means. Now, Globeleza, it's a group of people dancing, and there is one woman that the camera kind of focused on her, but she's not as naked as before. So they changed what they were selling in order to prevent criticism and to say, oh, okay, we're not being racist. We're taking her out because this was too much, and we realize that now, when it's in fact a lie. I did.
What it is, yeah.
I presented a paper about this in a conference in New Orleans a couple of years ago when I was still in grad school. And a man from the audience raised his hand and said, you know what? one of the things that I love about Brazilian Carnival is that you have so many naked women. We need to have that here too in New Orleans. We're missing that. I was like, you missed the point.
Yeah.
Like completely. that's not what I'm saying, please. So I like to try to make myself clear when I'm telling that story, and that's a good example
Oh,
of
thank
why.
you. My goodness.
Sure.
That was
Yeah.
intense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So Adam.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Similarities, or what are your thoughts on the,
Well,
you know, about any dancing?
one distinction,
dancing-
non-similarity. We're not having carnival in Northeast Tennessee.
Well,
No, nothing.
Lord, nobody's making that.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to your question.
What are your thoughts on the, are you cool with keeping it on the topic of like colorism, passing,
Sure.
just for now, we'll shift
Sure.
gears, but
Yeah.
in your experience,
Yeah.
you are born and raised?
Born and raised here in Jonesborough. And so, you know, well, I will tell the story. So, in Jonesborough, on Spring Street, a fella used to live on Spring Street, Mr. John D. Howard. Mr. John D. Howard had 3 brothers and a sister, Mr. Clarence, Mr. Tom, Mr. AZ, and Miss Geneva. And so the Howards were known, and if memory serves me correctly, Mr. Howard's father was an AME preacher, AME Zion preacher. Mr. John D. Howard, when I was growing up, I considered Mr. John D. my friend, if not best friend. And Mr. John D. was an older man then, and he lived for a while in Stoneacre, Virginia. And Stoneacre, Virginia was a coal town, and eventually went bust. Dug graves for a while, and never did know what the D stood for in John D. Howard. And so my father said D was for demon. And so every time my father would see him, say, "Demon, how you doing?" And so Mr. John D. Howard, he referred to himself as a stump barber. So here in the state of Tennessee, we actually have individuals that work for the state that will certify your barber's license, right? And so they'll check on all the styling establishments to make sure that you have your license up to date. And so the individual went by Mr. John Dees and said, John said you're supposed to have a license. And Mr. John told the story, I'm a stunt barber. And a stunt barber, I don't need no license. And so anyway, Mr. John D. Howard, when I had hair, which might be an indication of his skill, I don't know. But when I had hair, he would cut my hair, he'd cut my father's hair, cut a lot of the men's hair in town, and only charged, as far as I know, $1. Charged for me $1. Mr. John D. Howard was I attribute a lot of my growth, and if I've had any success, I attribute a portion of it to him, because Mr. John D. Howard, every time we go to the house, go back in the back room there and get the haircut, he'd bend down, he'd say, "Keep your head in them books, boy." Mm-hmm. And what Mr. John, he'd repeat it. And so Mr. John was just somebody that just really believed in me, and I just thought the world of it. So anyway, like I said, I love going back here in this back room, and there was just all these little knickknacks that Mr. John had on the wall and whatnot in the back room. And matter of fact, he had an old wood stove, and in the colder months, you get back here and that room would be ice cold, and they would throw some wood in there, and maybe wood, I guess it was a wood stove, and warm the place up, and it felt good. It had good memories of going back there to get your hair cut. Well, this one particular day, it's about 4 or 5 men that were there, and the men asked me to go outside and play. Now, you get a little age on you, and you kind of imagine the men wanted to talk. So I went outside, and Mr. John D. had a lawnmower out there, and And so I would sit on the lawnmower and play games, you know, play by myself, whatever. And I remember this one particular time, just wondering, well, I wonder what they're in there talking about. So I put my ear to the door, dare not go in. And like I said, my father, Mr. John, and a few other men, and they were talking about, and I heard one of them say, don't know who it was, but one of them said, well, you know, I don't like black women. And I thought, wait a second. Every last one of them are married to black women. But then I had to get some age on me to figure out, well, when I looked at my mama, when I looked at Miss Mary Howard, who we call Miss Boo, Mr. John's wife, and some of the other women, they were lighter skinned women. So when they said, I don't like black women, it was a color issue. It wasn't African American women, but it was darker skinned women. And so there was this idea about a lighter skinned woman. So at one time, it seemed to be very common in 20th century society to have a darker skinned man and a lighter skinned woman. And in a sense, it was a standard, you know, and so it was like a beauty standard. And so if you look at Northeast Tennessee, you better believe it, whether it's acknowledged, whether it was spoken, whether it's certified, it was certainly understood, if you look at Northeast Tennessee, that there was a color standard. There was a colored standard. And, you know, I think a lot of those traditions have subsided. But again, if you look at this part of the country, you know, you could tell that there were, again, a heavy presence of lighter skinned individuals. Yeah.
Very.
Wow.
I'm part of that Dr. Berry route. And I remember as a kid, my mom would, like I play outside, and in the middle of the summertime, she'd say, you know, wear a long sleeve shirt because you don't want to get too dark. And we didn't do sunscreen and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, there was that, even my mom knew, you don't want to be too dark.
Well, you know, it's funny because I wear a hat to this day, and it's the funniest thing. When I won my race 2012 for alderman, Marcy Holly, and I hope I'm not telling too much here, but whoever draws the cartoons in the Herald Tribune, I'll say that. so I didn't know if that was a secret or not. But anyway, the drawing in the cartoon in the Herald Tribune had former Alderman Fitzgerald and myself, and actually had me holding the hat, which let me know that I'm known for my hat. And the hat's right over there right now, matter of fact. And so anyway, and so I had my hat on, and where that came from was that my mother was always, you know, on me about wearing a hat. And summertime would come around, if I didn't have a hat, boy, what you doing with no hat on? You know, getting out there in that sun, you need something on your head. And so to this day, you know, I'm very mindful about wearing a hat. And it was funny because I was at church just the other day, and we had outdoor service, and there was a lot of people under the tent, and I don't think that this was an issue, but it just since we're talking about it, individuals said to me, Adam, don't you think you want to get under the tent? You know, the sun, it's getting hot. And I was like, well, no, actually, you know, I'm kind of glad to be out in the sun a little bit. So no, I'll be fine. But yes, color is very much an issue, particularly within Black life. And it's just been a part of our history. Yeah.
It's real. Yeah. Mine was different. My mom was like, get outside. Get his hand. And my dad too. He was like, why don't you have any black friends? And it was just because I played soccer and softball, and I maybe had like one other person of color on the team, but then my best friend was Chilean, and so, you know, we were diverse, but they were white passing, and he was always just, when we moved up here, he was counting my friends, and that's why I mentioned Tila McKinney,
Yeah,
one of
yeah,
my good buddies, a sleepover friend, and he was like, he'd pull her to the side, I'm just so glad Katelyn's got her a black friend, don't go anywhere now. I'm just like, that, shut up. And just so people listening know, my dad is the black one, and my mother is the white woman, so he was adamant about making sure they were trying to color me down and give me some black friends. Oh goodness. So do you think that the colorism, well, obviously, I mean, my interpretation of it is from historical figures. I mean, look at Jesus, white Jesus. That's that's a triggering topic. It's talking about, you know, Jesus wasn't a blue-eyed, blonde-headed white man holding a white lamb. And then there's lots of other instances of that. But do you think it's just almost like a, what is it, when subliminal type of just, you see it everywhere, and even in the historical, you know, the pharaohs and the Sphinx and stuff, and defacing the black features off of those things.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that, what are your thoughts on that? Yes,
ma'am. So it's certainly, this is where I guess I'm gonna try to get a little academic here, Dr. Fiuza, but it's certainly, I think, the you know, the European, I'm going to say, domination of culture. Certainly, what you just described about, you know, the Sphinx in Egypt and such. I mean, again, it's something when you hear individuals talk about how they would shave off the nostril, because again, the distinct African features. Certainly, when you think about the United States and the idea of, again, more of a Eurocentric standard, you know, so this idea of, again, wanting to at least align with the main cultural standard of the day. So again, this idea of, again, you know, being lighter, which would dominate black culture, you know, certainly throughout the 19th century to the first half of the 20th century, you know, the late 60s, you know, was the standard of a, you know, a lighter skin. Matter of fact, I would encourage you, if you want to do a little, you know, research, look at Clarence Thomas and his growth and evolution. And so Clarence Thomas, as a student at Yale, when he'd go to Yale Law School, Clarence Thomas, they would, when he was a student there, they would have these brown bag parties. So if you were darker than the brown bag, you couldn't get into the party. And of course, if you look at Justice Thomas, he was excluded from parties, which would fuel his frustration, because again, the African Americans at Yale and most of the Ivy League schools would be a certain type of African American, more than likely, you know, brown and lighter. And so now you've got someone from deep South Georgia going to Yale, different situation. And that's going to fuel his disdain. And so now by the early 80s, Ronald Reagan is elected president. Jesse Helms from North Carolina, a very prominent senator, along with Strom Thurmond, very prominent senator. And so now they're thinking about, how do we take, you know, the Afrocentric push of the 60s, and how do we kind of convert that to the conservative Republican movement? We need to think about, how do we bring more black people into the conservative thought process? And so Clarence Thomas was at the right place and at the right time. And Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms will adopt him as kind of surrogate fathers, and thus his meteoric rise within Republican circles. But a lot of that disdain is going to come from being a college student, being a darker skinned college student, and having to deal with those dynamics. So yeah, it's certainly this idea of trying to align with the mainstream culture.
I was actually teaching a class today that I did mention the white Jesus issue. My research has to do with cognitive sciences. So I studied literature looking into how the human brain works and how we understand things. And I talk about how the characters on the novels, or like in the stories, the short stories, how do they think? How do they react? Of course, I know that characters are made up beings. However, they are written as if they had a body and a mind in modern literature, right? So one of the things that I do study out of this universe, this huge universe of cognitive sciences, which is a universe that is interdisciplinary, that involves neurology, psychology, philosophy, literature, and all. There is one field in one specific book called Metaphors We Live By. And that book was written by a philosopher and a linguistic person, Lakoff and Johnson. And what they say is that our brains, people think a lot that our thoughts come from our language, right? But that's a misunderstanding. Thought precedes language. Otherwise, how could people who are, for instance, impaired, right, have thoughts? Mm-hmm. And they do. And animals have thoughts too. And there are many who are cognitive scientists that they are as complex as humans' thoughts. Dolphins, for instance, or many apes. So they talk about conceptual metaphors in that book, Metaphors We Live By. And what is a conceptual metaphor? So it is a metaphor that is wired in our brains due to human evolution. The way that we evolved, we tend to think in a particular way about abstract things. So I'll give you the first example that they use in the book because it's a very striking one. Argument is war. So whenever you talk about having an argument, whenever you talk about what is an argument, or whenever you describe an argument with someone, you describe it in terms of war. You attack, you defend, you destroy, you weaken your opponent, right? Mm-hmm. So everything that you think when you think about having an argument is related to being at war. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I was talking today about a conceptual metaphor based on a short story by an Ecuadorian writer. And the short story, it's about a man and a woman who are slaves living in ancient Rome. It doesn't say where they are from, just say that they are slaves and that they are translating Homer. That's their job as slaves, because they are slaves in Rome. Mm-hmm. And they are translating Homer for the 120 times, something like that. I forgot the number right now, but it's a ridiculous amount of time. That's what they have been doing for the good part of their lives. And I came up with this metaphor to explain these stories to the students, which is modernity is good. So every time that we think about something that is modern, we think in good terms. We always want the latest iPhone, right? So the way that the story evolves, they have two daughters. Both daughters are raped. One is forced into marriage, and the father is proud of her because she's going to have a Roman child. And the other one is raped by a butcher that they sue and they lose in the law. The slaves in Rome had rights and they could sue if their rights were broken. And because she was raped, then they get to sue, but they lose it in the short story. So I explained to the students that Ecuador doesn't have a prominent writer in the global world. It doesn't have an Argentine writer like Borges, like Argentina does. I mean, it doesn't have Machado de Assis like Brazil does. It doesn't have Gabriel Garcia Marquez like Colombia does. I did a PhD in Spanish literature. My wife is doing hers in Latin American literature. And when I told her that I was going to teach a class about Ecuadorian literature, she looked at me did we ever study Ecuadorian literature? I don't recall. And I said, no, we didn't. And that's what the short story is about. Why? Because it's a story about identity, about roots, about how we created this concept, because Lakoff and Johnson talk about primary metaphors and secondary metaphors. So modernity is good is a primary metaphor. And a second one that was created by our society as a whole is that Greeks are modern, right? Greek is modern. So everything that comes from Greece is considered something modern. It's something classical, because that's the trick with something that it's classical, right? It's never out of date. It's always modern. So we have the enlightening. We have so many artworks that we still keep and that are Greek inspired. So we have this two slaves in short story, and he says that they complete each other, although they don't talk to each other anymore. They don't have sexual relations anymore. They're still married, but they don't even look at each other's face. And the reason why they complete each other is because her Latin is better than his, and his Greek is better than hers. So it's a linguistic issue, right? Okay, so just giving a little bit more about conceptual metaphors while I have your attention and we're talking about that subject, in what comes to color and how colorism can be rooted in those conceptual metaphors too. Well, as a response, as an evolutionary response, because evolution, if we follow Darwin, is about two things, right? It's about multiplication. You want to multiply in order to, for your cells to stay alive, and you want to better the other, right? Those are the two principles. So in order to survive, we did evolve some responses, some like the gap, like the gap response when you have something that you feel disgusted, like the gap face, right? Why do we do that? That face. We are actually warning people around us, and this is a philosopher from Purdue University. His last name is Kelly. He has a book called The Evolutionary Principle of Disgust. And he says that at first we evolved this response to warn other people around us about food or about something that could be poisonous to what we eat. And later on, because our health and our cooking evolved too, then we were not that concerned about what we were eating. Then we evolved into social disgust. And what is social disgust? Social disgust, it's when you look at something that someone from a different culture does and that you feel it's something disgusting. And when I say by another culture, I'm not talking about someone who necessarily comes from another country like I did. I'm talking about in the same island, which is the example that he gives in the book. There is an island in the Oceania area. I never said that name out loud in English. I learned how by reading. Did I say right? Do you understand what I mean? Okay. So there is one island there. There, people from the north of the island have a rite of passage for male individuals once they reach maturity. And people from the southern part of the island have a different rite of passage, right? People from the north believe that in order to become a man, a young boy needs to ejaculate in the older man needs to ejaculate in the mouth of the younger boy. And people from the south believe that they need to ejaculate in their anus. So they both find what the other culture does disgusting. You probably find
Oh,
both.
well,
Yeah. The Purdue philosopher, he said disgust. Okay, yeah,
We all
yeah,
just
yeah,
exercise
yeah,
that.
yeah. Okay.
When he
Yeah,
starts
you made that point come alive. Okay.
when
Yeah.
when he presents this, he usually starts his presentation with a cheesecake. Because who doesn't love cheesecake, right? You kind of relax, ooh, cheesecake. And then he goes and talks about those things because, so I have this idea which hasn't been pursued yet. And that I never seen written in anywhere by anyone, when it comes to colorism and the dark, because there is one article that I found where they discuss the dark as being dangerous. And it's an article, it's an essay about movies and how the dark in movies is always depicted as something dangerous. Like,
Yes, sir.
when you have that person who's trying to go down the stairs and the light doesn't go on, and that creates in you that expectation, right? Well, this guy is going to lose his head right now, right? You kind of expect that.
Don't do it, girl.
So, and there are many, and he quotes many finds and uses that metaphor, the dark is dangerous. So what if we match, like what if we put those two things together, right? What if we put the social disgust and the idea of the dark being dangerous? Because from an evolutionary perspective, well, dark was dangerous, right? Not dark people, like going out in the dark was dangerous. You could be attacked, you could be eaten by a wild animal.
Mhm.
It was safer to go out during the day. And what if in our brains those things are still wired together? Right? Because if we're talking about evolution, then we're talking about things that take not hundreds, but thousands of years to come by.
Yeah.
And that would explain why your dad's friend didn't like
Well,
dark women,
No.
right?
now take that just a little bit further. Now, as you flesh that out, Felipe, I think about like terms like blackball.
Yep. Blackmail. Yep.
Blackmail.
Blackmail.
There are certain terms that we use that have roots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, to think that there was a time in American history where people of color, what we now POC, people of color,
Mm-hmm.
African Americans, did not want to be labeled black.
Mm-hmm.
The whole notion of the black cat,
Mm-hmm.
the black cat is that's a sign.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope I never forget individual here in town now passed away, preferred to be called colored. Now this is something like 2002, 2003.
Mm-hmm.
On the phone with him, and I mean, this gentleman knew. I mean, he was just a repository of knowledge, and loved talking to him. I mean, you could sit on the phone just talk to him for hours, and he would talk about the colored cemeteries all throughout Washington County. About 12 colored cemeteries in the county. And I remember called him by name and said, I'd love to go to those African American cemeteries. And then for a note, he came back, kept talking about color. So finally, I had to ask, why are you using the term colored? He preferred colored as opposed to black.
Mm-hmm.
Black was that really meant something.
Mm-hmm.
To say black, but to say that you're colored,
Mm-hmm.
that was a very so it's something to be said about how these terms are kind of infused in us and how we kind of relate to those terms. So when you talk about the evolution of social disgust, that's intriguing, very intriguing. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I got a quick question. So we've got about, I'm gonna say 20 minutes.
Okay.
We're gonna go
Yeah.
over a little bit because we started.
Yeah.
late.
Yes, because we started late. We're gonna
And I want
compensate.
to say that I'm sorry for being here late, but my wife was in a car accident. Adam knows this
Mhm.
about a month ago.
Okay.
So before coming, I had to prepare her a plate and give it
Hey,
to her.
listen, family
Yeah.
first.
Yes.
We were ready to cover and just grill Adam for
Yeah.
an hour, so don't worry whatsoever. And so you heard that, folks. Don't worry about anything.
Yeah.
But do you both happen to have a question for each other that you thought about?
You got a question?
Oh, wow. No, I didn't. I thought that you all
We have
would,
plenty of questions.
you were
Okay.
going to
Yeah, we
ask the
got
questions.
plenty.
Oh, you got more questions.
Yeah.
I will say, I'll make a statement. So Felipe, one of the things that's really, really attached me to Felipe is the fact of his Brazilian upbringing and his statements to me about Afro-Brazilian culture.
Mhm.
Okay. And so I'm very intrigued to learn about this particular piece. Now you've touched on
Mhm.
certain things that you see and you think about, of course, Africans and the African diaspora coming to Brazil, and of course the Brazil and Cuba, and then of course the United States. So I'm very intrigued to hear about this Afro-Brazilian culture, the religious expressions. I'm just looking forward to that at the appropriate time.
Mhm.
And also a thought that I had, and I may be way off, but the notion that particularly in Portuguese society,
Mhm.
that the thought, well, if you proclaimed allegiance to Portuguese society, even if you were black, then you could be adopted as, in a sense, Portuguese.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, in a sense, it's claiming that level of loyalty to the country as opposed to your identity. So, if you released your identity, proclaim allegiance to the national identity, so to
Mhm.
speak, then you could be adopted or received. Now, to me, that's just very interesting, because I think about throughout American history, if that's all it took, I think that you would see some I know you would have seen some extremely patriotic, Black Americans. So at the appropriate time, I'm just looking forward to having that conversation with you.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. That's
yeah.
not something that happened in Brazil, though. That's something European. That's from like in Portugal.
Okay.
Because they would take, we're talking about a huge machine for exportation, right? And in this case, they were exporting human beings, but they still treated those human beings as cell phones or
Mhm.
books, unfortunately. So that happened, but it was in Portugal, because they would see these slaves that were in Portugal, these people that were in Portugal, as domesticated. And you do have documentation about them showing people who were taken from Africa in circus shows throughout Europe, right? And that was something from the Portuguese Empire that happened there, but didn't happen in Brazil.
I see.
You didn't have that option. When the Paraguayan War happened, that I mentioned before, then they could pledge allegiance to the Empire of Brazil, fight in the war, and if they survived, then they would get their freedom. Taking consideration that the Paraguayan War happened after the Civil War here in the U.S., and they knew about it, so they kind of took what they learned from what happened here to there. I want to touch base on something that you said before, Adam, about the wording. When I was growing up in Brazil, and we're talking about a very racist family. My family is my father and mother, and unfortunately, they are racist to this day. Nowadays, less, thank God. But my mom would refuse to give a, a glass of water to someone who was a person of color, saying that you would stain the glass or you would be disgusting to drink from the glass later. And I would have to give water to people in hiding. And she would try to do the opposite of what your parents did and try to forbid me from having African Brazilian friends. We don't say African Brazilian in Brazil. That's a new thing. We started to say that. We take a lot from what is done here. So Du Bois was a huge influence in Brazil. And as you know, he claimed and he tried to use the N word and he tried to rephrase the N word and say it in a different way in order to regain control over the world, right? That was Du Bois' idea. So when I was growing up, I was taught that I had to say the N word instead of black, because black was offensive. Black was a color. Black wasn't a race. And in order to be respectful, I had to use the N word, which is not the N word exactly. It is a word that comes from Du Bois. It's the Du Bois version of the N word.
So just for the sake, Negro?
Yes.
Negro. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
That's
We can say it. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yes.
got
Not the other one.
I got
So
you. Got
Du
you.
Bois used that word, and that's the word that I was taught to use when I was growing up. And when I first came to the US, it surprised me how back in 2010, everyone was still using black instead of people of color like we are right now, which I think it's a good, very comprehensive idea, and how we are saying POC and all that, and how it's inclusive and everything. I love that term.
Which, I just want to interject. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, somebody made a comment that they had a friend recently say to stop using BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, and to say black and brown. So what are your thoughts on that?
I use black and brown quite a bit, and I think it's important when you're talking about folks that if you're talking about the black community. For some reason, in my language, I prefer black more so than African American, and I can't tell you exactly why, but I just prefer the term black. It's not offensive. If anything, I think there's a level of empowerment to be black. There's a period, and I know we just got a little bit of time, but there's a period where you think about well, what is it to be American? And you talk about Dr. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois talks about this double consciousness. How can I be both American and at that time be a Negro or be black? How can I be both? And how do you achieve that successfully in a racialized society? And so this is something to me to be black. There's a beautiful conversation. Maybe at another time we'll have it about discovering blackness. That's another discussion for another day.
Yeah. Discussed with us, with the freedom fighters back last summer. What does it mean to be black? Is it just a construct, a mental,
Yes, ma'am.
What makes you black?
Yes, ma'am.
Sort of thing.
Yes, ma'am.
And that's something I've struggled with because I am biracial. But if we were gonna, African American, I don't really connect with that either, because if it was gonna be what my ancestry says I am, then I'd be African European.
Right.
And that's just weird. So, I can identify as black, and it's the one drop rule. I'm dark, I've got textured hair, and so I'm obviously not white. So that's just, It's
Yeah.
almost very black and white.
So
Yeah.
it lets you know that this whole thing is a social construct.
Mhm.
You know, at the end of the day,
At the end of the day, it is.
it's a social construct.
Mhm.
And so if Dickson decides right today, I am an American, 100% American, I'm going to live my life as an American.
Yeah.
You know, well then I am denying. I'm denying two and some odd years century, 2 centuries and some odd years of history related to people that look like me.
Mhm.
I'm denying that.
Yeah.
You know, and so I know there's a lot of people. Why can't we just be American?
Mhm.
Well, you know, as we look throughout our wonderful American history, we're going to see time and time again that people want to strive,
Mhm.
but then they are brought back into a rather painful reality that you are the other.
Mhm.
And so at some point in time, you either, and I heard you allude to this, Felipe,
Mhm.
you either decide that I'm going to reject it, or I'm going to try to get control over it,
Mhm.
and I'm going to take ownership of it.
Mhm.
And that's where we get into what is blackness.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You know, and so at some point in time, I have to figure out, you know, and I don't know if my white brothers and sisters have ever had to go through that situation or not, but at some point in time, I have to figure out who am I and how am I going to live in this society,
Mhm.
you know, and try to succeed. Am I going to be bitter? Am I going to be very visceral? Am I going to be hateful? Am I going to be angry all the time? You know, die at an early age of heart disease and everything else because I'm mad and because of this history? Or am I going to determine that, you know, there is a path for me? And so at some point in time as black people, and I think every black person goes through that particular that stage where we have to figure out how are we going to make it in a society that is, my words, racialized.
Mhm.
I think everybody would like to be. I hear you.
Yeah.
I was waving my hand in the air and he was preaching.
I think everybody would like to be American.
Yeah.
Period.
Mhm.
But if you're not treated like all, and I'll say like all the other white Americans or the Americans that are white, then you have to ask why. And is it because of my black skin
Mhm.
or someone else who has a brown skin or because my skin is darker than your brown skin? I mean,
Mhm.
but I think everybody just let me be American.
Yes.
And not-
Yes.
And yet the name of the country, it's not America. that's the continent. I am American too, right?
Mhm.
That's another problem
True.
that people usually
Yes.
don't address enough, right?
Yes.
Even if you say, oh, but we are North Americans. Yes, so are Mexicans and Canadians.
Yes.
And they don't appreciate either the fact that the US has taken this
The word. And just
identity and
Yes.
said, this is us. No, it's not.
Yes.
So are we.
Right.
And it's complicated. In Spanish, the word that people use to talk about people from the United States is estadounidense, which directly translates someone from the United States. It doesn't even have the word America
Ah,
on it when talking about people from here. So
yeah, I've thought about that too. I always think when, people say God bless America, I'm like, is it North America? Is it Canada?
Well.
You were talking about, it's, again, I think in my own head, that's that ego. We own it all. We're
Yeah.
gonna claim it all, even though you don't.
world champions.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, that wears me
World
out.
champions.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe,
and I mean all that without
American.
with all due respect, and I don't mean to be offensive, but it goes to the white Jesus thing again, right? And why it was, what did I talk about white Jesus? I didn't get to explain it. I ended up explaining other things. Well, I refer to the white Jesus and the whitening because we have the most famous writer in Brazil. It's called Machado de Assis, and he was an African Brazilian. However, I read all of his books without knowing that he was an African Brazilian. However, on the history books in Brazil, he is white, or he was white until about 10 years ago. Only now people are rediscovering our biggest writer and rediscovering the fact that he was African American. Why? Because, well, he was a great writer. He wrote over 9 novels. He is respected and studied all over the world. We have many specialists here in the US who study his work. He is compared to writers like Shakespeare. So, and that man is an African Brazilian from the 19th century who was the first president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. Brazil has an Academy of Letters and Portugal doesn't. And Machado de Assis was the first president of it. However, he underwent a process of whitening because they used him as a symbol for how good Brazil could be, how good our literature can be, how great our culture is. And in order to do that, they had to make him white. And I suspect, of course, I can't say that for sure, but I suspect that same thing happened with Jesus. I mean, think about it. Do anyone who is from the Middle East or from Egypt have blue eyes and blonde hair?
I mean,
No, they
it's
don't.
rare.
With all due respect, right? They don't. Okay, so who creates the Christianism from modern time? Well, we have the Roman Catholic Church. They're Romans. They need to make the God to look like them. Like, think about gods. Thor. Who does Thor look like? Well, he looks like Norwegians because he was created by Norwegians. Talk about African gods, from the Yoruba religion. Iemanjá, Oshun, Shango. Who do they look like? Well, they look like Africans because they are from Africa. And there is a short story that I love from a Latin American writer. I forgot the name of the writer right now, but the short story, it's called The God of the Flies. And it's really short. It's about 1 paragraph. It's about how the flies created their God. And their God was another fly. And sometimes was a big fly, sometimes was a tiny fly, sometimes had 1,000 wings, sometimes had no wings at all, sometimes was a golden, sometimes was purple, sometimes was blue, sometimes was red, but it was nonetheless a fly. And when the flies die, they go to, if they are good flies, they go to the heaven of flies. They go to, if they're bad flies, they go to the hell of flies. And the hell of flies, it's a place that is so clean and perfect. There's no trash for you to fly on. So it talks a lot about perspective, right? About we are human beings. If we are going to create a God for ourselves or worship a God, it makes sense that we worship something that is created to our image. Now, think about that in terms of colonization, okay? Think about that, about the Spaniards coming to the America and talking with the Aztecs and telling them, God sent us, and this is God. And we came in the name of the King, who is the representation, the embodiment of God on earth. And they had horses, right?
Yeah.
They had horses. They were on top of horses, and they had never seen horses before. What did they do? I'll worship your king. Yes, you are the true God. I mean, my God doesn't have a horse.
Yeah.
And if that's the only and true God, and it looks like you, then, well,
Okay.
so be it, right? So
Yeah.
it's a lot about representation. And again, I mean that with no offense. You may have all the beliefs that you want to have. I have my own. I had to know this. I was raised in a religion that has a lot of African Brazilian roots, and that comes from African Brazilian religions called they are called Candomblé, and I forgot the name. I was raised in the Candomblé. I will remember. And in Caribe, it's called Santeria. My religion was called Spiritism. and was created by a French guy called Allan Kardec, who studied Yoruba culture and who created another religion, whitening everything.
Wow.
Again, so we have the same beliefs. I was raised to believe in reincarnation, that we are beings of spirits who are occupying a body made of meat, but when we die, our spirits go to another dimension, and you get to improve your spirit by doing good and by doing good things here. And if you do bad, then you go to an inferior plane. So it's not just about heaven and hell, it's about several different planes and about finding balance in the world. Now you come from a modern is good and Greek is modern, and then you crush all those beliefs from Native Americans, from Africans, from Asians, and from everyone, and you say that all that attempt to find balance between man and nature is bad because it's old, it's not modern, right? And that's why you have white Jesus. And you can continue to believe in Jesus knowing and thinking about all these things that I'm talking about, and I expect you do. I believe in Jesus. I go to the Catholic Church nowadays. When I met my wife, and the good thing about my religion that I was raised on is that they say that all religions are good as long as they are telling you to do good things. Mm-hmm. That you can go to any temple and worship God and try to improve yourself, and that's fine. So my wife told me, look, you can believe in whatever you want to believe, but I go to church 3 times a week. I sing on church, and you're expected, if you want to date me, to go to church with me, sing with me, and shut up. Otherwise, we're not going to date, because I'm only dating someone with whom I can marry.
Equally yoked.
Equal, and when we have children, I'm going to raise my children into the Catholic Church. And I said, okay. But when the Catholic Church does bad things, I'm going to tell the children that that's bad. If you excuse me, I'll know, that's fine. Okay, we have a deal. Yeah. So I go to the Catholic Church and I keep my mouth shut, and I sing and I praise and praise the Lord and everything. But I still get to keep my identity. So that was a much better deal than the native Brazilians got, right? Because their deal was, look, you either believe in this God which was made at the image of the God and who looks a lot like me, or else. That was the deal, right?
Yeah.
Or else. So I think I have a good deal.
Well, so we already have had requests to have a part 2, which we're going to have.
Oh, really?
They have said that this is very rich and on a different level. And then I do have one quick question. I know this person very well. And her question, among many other comments, was, how do you refer to Black Americans in Spanish? They took a Spanish class once and said, "Yo soy negro," and the teacher almost fainted.
I think that teacher was probably here in the U.S., and that's probably why they almost fainted. Being a Brazilian up to 5 years ago, I had no problem using that word because, especially in Brazil, because it was the standard and it was what I was told to use. Yeah. And there was a movement in Brazil called 100%, and then they had the N-word. From Dubois. I'm not gonna say it. I can't say it. I can say it nowadays.
Yeah, I love that word.
and I know that I'm not pronouncing Dubois the way that you all pronounce it,
No, you're
but
good.
his name is French, and I know that that's how you pronounce in French.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's why
That's
I went
WD,
with
right?
that.
W.B. Du
Yeah,
Bois.
that's
Yeah.
Maybe Dubois.
I had
Yeah.
when you mentioned that, I'm like, oh, you got that, I got
Mhm.
Yes, what he said, what he
Yes.
said, what he
Yes.
said.
Yes.
So
But-
that guy was hugely important for Brazilian.
Yeah, we're gonna have to explain
African
to the folks some of these
Brazilian
characters
movement.
at part 2.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean,
Most-
W.E.B. Du Bois shapes the 20th century in terms of race and the study of race and public intellectual. So I'm excited to hear that. I did not realize that his influence was as strong in Brazil,
Oh yeah.
because
it
I mean
was.
the Souls of Black Folk is still a critical piece of the Black literary canon, you know.
There
So-
was a theatrical movement in Brazil in the 40s. We need to stop talking.
Yeah, y'all got like 1 minute.
Yeah,
Okay.
No, this is
Okay.
wonderful. We
Okay.
do have to find this topic for
And
it.
it's called
I mean, I want to
it was
listen
called
to
the Arena Theater, and it had one guy called Abdias Nascimento, who took everything that Dubois said and applied it to Brazilian theater. And yeah, he's huge. There is an Abdias Nascimento Center in Bahia, which is the state in Brazil that has the biggest African Brazilian population.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Ah, well,
This has
Well,
been
listen,
fabulous.
here's your call to action. Y'all look up W.E.B. Du Bois, and I guess stay tuned. There's in Brazil and just colorism. Look into that if you've not heard about it.
I think you should look into dancing naked in the street.
Yes, for advertisement purposes for the next festival or carnival. But thank you. But yeah, Ren's a body painter. By the way. Very good one.
We may bring Brazil to
Bring it
Jonesborough.
here. Well, thank you both
Thank
so
you.
much
You're
for
welcome.
coming.
Thank you.
This has been way more than we even anticipated.
Exactly.
But we are. Oh, did it? I just flipped it.
Oh,
okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier on, but we will definitely be putting out there about a part 2, because I know that there's
Yes.
plenty more to
Fabulous.
discuss. Yes, I learned a tremendous amount of knowledge tonight.
All
Did you?
right.
I saw you taking notes.
I feel like I was in school.
It was great. We didn't have to comment as much. We made our jobs very easy tonight. But again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Please be sure to check out the McKinney Center. They've got lots of wonderful things going on. The Masterpiece Reveal is coming up, which is a very cool spin on the Masterpiece Mingle, which is a fundraising event. This is a safer way to do it. It will be featured through Zoom, and then we've just got some folks saying how wonderful everything was. Thank you,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you all again
Next month.
if not sooner.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk to these guests. You all have a good evening. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.